If we could make people come together, if we could force them to spend time with one another, and particularly force them to spend time with people who probably come from very different circumstances of their own, would we be able to improve the relationships that Americans have with one another? And if we could, would it be worth the cost that we would pay for forcing people to do so? That's the theme that we've chosen to debate about tonight. The motion that we're going to encounter is that all US citizens should be required to perform 1 year of community or military service between the ages of 18 and 22. Now, when we're debating this, we're exploring whether or not this is a good idea. Obviously, we don't have the power to pass this as policy. But I think that having these discussions, whether amongst the 4 debaters that I'm going to introduce in a moment, or having these discussions with your friends over a beer or a cup of coffee, is the kind of conversation that we need to be having when thinking about what we must do to rescue our nation from the current circumstances in which we find ourselves. Let me tell you a little bit about how the debate's going to work, and then I'll introduce the debaters who are going to be testing the question tonight. For this debate, we're going to use a modified version of the style of debate that we compete in when we travel to competitions around the United States and around the world, or more accurately, when we log on to competitions hosted by universities around the US and around the world. The form is based roughly on the type of debate that happens in the British House of Commons, which really means nothing more than that there are a few things borrowed from that type of debate that you might recognize here. We're going to start with one 7-minute speech from a member of the pro side and alternate between the pro and the con side until each of the 4 speakers has had one 7-minute opportunity to make their best arguments for or against the motion. During those 7-minute speeches, the debaters on the opposing side might raise what's called a point of information. A point of information is just a brief interruption of the speech, during which the person requesting the point of information stands or verbally asks for a point of information. This primary speaker can surrender the floor at that point and allow their opponent to ask a brief question. That person then sits back down, the primary speaker returns to the floor and continues on with their speech, incorporating their answer or their response to the question in the course of their speech. It's important for you to understand that the primary speaker is not obligated to take a point of information. In fact, it's entirely possible that they might make a decision about either strategy or timing that will cause them to refuse a point of information at any particular time. Thus, you might see a lot of requests for points of information, but the speaker saying not at this time or no thank you, that's perfectly acceptable. They're not being rude. They're expected to manage their time appropriately when interacting with that other team. Those points of information are allowed during the first 4 speeches, after the first minute, and before the last minute of each of those speeches. You'll hear a bell ring, as will the debaters, that indicates when those points of information are allowed. Following those 4 7-minute speeches, we're going to open up the floor to you, all the people who are watching, to ask questions or make comments to the debaters that you want them to react to interactions that you would like to see the debaters address, to questions that you might have that you would like them to answer. Marcia is going to be monitoring the Q&A portion of Zoom. And so as the debate unfolds, or during that 10 or 15-minute period after those 4 speeches, by all means, feel free to put your questions or your comments into chat or into the Q&A section, and she will convey them to us so that we can interact with you and get some dialogue going about what you feel about the debate and what questions that you have. Following that 10 or 15 minutes of interaction, we'll return to the debaters, providing them each a 4-minute opportunity to summarize their position. Now, each side gets only one summary speech, and we're going to start with the pro side, we're going to start with the con side, give them the chance to close their case, and then we'll return to the pro side, who originally was responsible for advancing the motion, to provide the last word on the debate. All of that should take roughly an hour, so I'm looking forward to hearing what these debaters have to say, and I hope you'll stick with us for the entirety of the debate as well. At this point, let me introduce the debaters. I'm not sure the camera is going to pick them up, but I'll give you the order in which they're going to speak tonight so that you have an idea of who you're going to be watching. The pro side is represented by 2 people. Speaking first is Athenia Large. Athenia is a senior debater who's been with us for a number of years. She's majoring in natural sciences and aspires to go to med school soon. Her partner this afternoon or this evening is going to be Henry Milden, who also is a senior debater here at UAA. Henry's majoring in economics and public policy, and I'm not sure what Henry aspires to do, but I know it has something to do with money eventually. Speaking on the con side is going to be Cora Lyon first. Cora is a senior bioscience and health science major. She too is going to be taking the MCAT soon with Athenia and aspires to go to medical school next year. Her partner is going to be Birch Boyer, who is a senior majoring in mechanical engineering, and Birch wants to solve complex problems and save the world, as they all do. All of these debaters have been with the Seawolf Debate program for a number of years. I am pleased to have them with us tonight and looking forward to the arguments that they're going to make. With that, then, I'd like to open the floor to our first speaker for the pro side and ask her to make the 7-minute argument that argues on behalf of requiring 1 year of community or military service for all U.S. citizens between the ages of 18 and 22.
To begin with, I'd like to identify the problem. Regarding the military, our confidence in our military is down. Only 56% of Americans have a great deal of trust and confidence in the military, which is down from 70% in just 2018. Only 12.5% of Americans consider the military as a career or transitional step. And for years, the Army and the Marine Corps have struggled to achieve the $100,000 or the 100,000 yearly recruits they need to maintain current force levels. So recruiting has become expensive. Sign-on bonuses cost $600 million in 2018, which was up from only $290 million in 2017, the year before. Additionally, regarding community service, our social support systems are overtaxed and unable to meet the needs of a growing and shifting society. Civic participation is degrading, and meaningful citizenship seems like a thing of the past. We believe our model can solve this. What is our model? We think all citizens, male or female, should be required to register with the Selective Service and choose 1 year of service between the ages of 18 and 22 to participate either in a national service program like the military or the Marine Corps. And we believe this can be a choice between doing it before or after college if they choose to attend college. There will be no exceptions to this. Individuals will have the freedom to choose what type of service and what type of project they want to work on and find what is best suited to their views and abilities. Failure to register will lead to reminders to register in an increasingly stringent tone and escalate into employment difficulties or potential legal actions for individuals without a selective service number. Why do we think that it's important? First, I have two main points here. The first point is why we owe our country 1 year of our lives. The social contract we have with our state demands something from both the government and the citizens. Citizens are increasingly used to feeling entitled to make demands of the state, and we believe that the government should increase the demands made on the citizens in return. Opposition might tell you that this is an infringement on the individual rights to choose. But I would like to explain to you that polling of youth found that 87% believe that national service can be a part of civic duty. 81% support expanding the budget of AmeriCorps, and 71% would consider serving voluntarily. Right now, AmeriCorps has about 750,000 people participating. However, many of those are seniors. Practically, we know that there are approximately 4,200 18-year-old Americans today, this year. That would mean every year we would have between 4,000 and 4,200 individuals to provide military or civic volunteers. So that's $600 million of money that's given to recruit could be spent instead on expanding AmeriCorps and other services to enhance our community. Secondly, we believe self-rule demands investment by the citizens. Developing policies, implementing them, and keeping our state secure takes work at an individual level. We think exposure brings understanding of this. 1 minute, and I'll take the question. First, there are impacts, positive impacts to implementing a mandatory year of service. First, you would develop a respect for how difficult creating policy and turning it into implementation can be. Secondly, it can forge a link between your civic rights and your civic responsibility. Third, it will increase the trust we have in our civic institutions and in the military. If you've been there personally, or if you have friends and family serving, you will trust it more. And finally, it can increase trust between social groups and build bridges between people that wouldn't interact necessarily normally. but are now your brothers in arms or working together with you on valuable civic projects? I'll take your question.
Yeah, can you go into more detail on the punishment if you choose not to go into this program?
Sure, like I said, we'll send out like text reminders, emails. We could phone, call people, and then increasingly, if people fail to register for selective service, employment difficulties or legal action. So, and similar to the ways that we have, child support, payments that aren't met affects your tax returns and stuff, and how legal action is self-explanatory, but increasingly, like, you wouldn't be able to get employment, your tax returns could be penalized if you don't serve. Does that answer your question? Great. So my second main point is the major benefit here, other than what I said, bringing social groups together, the major benefit is how we turn complacency and outrage into engagement. 89% of youth see direct service in communities as the most effective way to make change. More than servicing government, more than working in politics, more than joining the private sector, and definitely more effective than just complaining on social media. This also provides much needed help to our institutions, ones that are often taken for granted. For example, helping provide food, shelter, and other services after hurricanes, floods, and natural disasters, like what's happening in Texas now, or what happened in Louisiana earlier this year. As we see increasing need for this, we definitely believe that we have an increasing call to make on our citizens. Finally, let me tell you about some impacts. This develops respect for and a deeper understanding of how involvement really works. Individually, these youths will develop and build their personal effectiveness skills and their confidence. And it'll help them personally to build their resumes and then give them a step towards excelling at their future goals. So in conclusion, the right to choose how to engage in your civic duty and responsibility remains. You have a choice in whether it's military or what kind of civic duty it is. But the responsibility to dedicate yourself to your state is something that we believe should be mandatory for all citizens. Thank you very much.
Here at the side opposition, we strongly believe in civic duty, but the problem we have with the government case is making it involuntary. So first, let's look at the punishment. Essentially, you're going to get less on your tax returns. You're going to have some of your wage back. What that becomes is a fee for the rich and a major imposition for individuals without monetary benefits. We see that just like selective service was in the past, people will get waived out of the program by paying these fees and just continuing on with their lives, while those who cannot are continually harmed. So I'm going to break my speech into two different parts: harms to the individual and harms to the state. Starting with harms to the individual. It infringes on the autonomy of these individuals because they do not own their labor. Nowhere in the model did we hear about these individuals getting paid for their service. Nowhere did we hear about how they're going to afford housing, food, shelter. Nowhere did we hear about these individuals who may have to support families. They might have their own children. They might need to support their siblings or their parents, or have other unique situations that in which, with no exceptions, they can no longer maintain. For example, with no exception for people with disabilities, people may no longer be able to get proper medical care because they are no longer covered, because this year of service will not include that kind of benefit. These individuals will see immeasurable harms to their health and to their family. This is a direct change to the respect that government believes is going to occur, because they will be harmed and their families will be harmed, because they will no longer have the ability to improve on their own lives because they don't have this autonomy. This means that we're actually seeing more distrust in the military and the government, creating a problem that's worse than it is now. Go ahead.
The military provides benefits such as pay and medical help to the people participating in the military. There's no reason to believe we wouldn't still be providing these services to the people who joined through this program.
Okay, but the problem is that the community service aspects, the ones that people get to quote unquote choose between, does not include these kind of benefits. So now these individuals who either get to choose to be in a safe position where they can work domestically or join the military and risk their lives, especially when the first speaker's issue is the problem with signing bonuses with the military. These are the individuals that are risking their lives for our freedoms. Why are we trying to take money away from their ability to provide for themselves, their future, and their families? We believe that these should still exist, but that it should be voluntary for people to join these services, not forced, especially if they want healthcare, especially if they want a wage. If their only option for this year is the military, that harms them more. And then I'm going to talk about unfair distribution for these individuals, because anyone with ties within the organization, rich parents, rich family, are going to be able to, if they choose community service, if they choose the military, get safer or better positions. They may choose healthcare, and what we will see is people with ties in the community, with higher socioeconomic status, they're going to be able to work at a desk and work administratively, whereas people who won't might have to work with patients, which exposes them to hazardous materials, bodily fluids, which can be hazardous to health, and sharps. Or you want to work on improving the road system. That'll include some people in administrative offices, but that also includes construction workers, in which annually 1 in 200 construction workers receive fatal accidents on the job. This is going to be putting people in harm's way for no benefits. And again, it will create this massive distrust within our institutions. This leads me to my second point, which is harms to the state. First, on the military. Just as it was during the Vietnam War, when people were drafted, people will go because they're required to, and then they'll leave the second they can. This is wasted investment in these individuals, especially as the person who asked the POI pointed out, these people would still get the bonuses. They'd still get the benefits, but they're going to leave the second they can. If they join the military under this program, they would get VA benefits. If it's only for the year, those benefits would likely include for their lives. This is a continual uprising cost for individuals who are not using the training. Instead, the military has said that they want people who want to be in the military because they're spending lots of money on training and materials that no longer exist. Plus, if you want to improve people's vision of the military, it's not by people knowing people in the military, it's by having an effective military. If people who don't want to be in the military are doing that service, they're not going to do it as well because they don't want to be there. This will decrease the view of the military, both domestically and internationally, when it is seen as somewhere where people have to go for a year. The second part, which ties to that point, is coercion. Coercion decreases morale, which decreases output. This is true in the military when you're spending so many resources getting people trained, and then they leave as soon as they can. But it's also true in the community service organizations. If you are now having people 18 to 22 who are now working in nursing homes, they don't care about the patients. They may have chosen nursing homes because it sounded like the easiest gig they could get for the year. That means that those people who they are directed to care for are going to get worse care. The last speaker pointed out that 89% of youth see direct engagement as the best way of affecting their community. Why not let these people choose how and when to do this direct engagement? Apparently, they already want to, as given by the stats and government. Let them choose what works best for them. What have I told you in my speech today? I've told you how this harms the individual, especially people with low socioeconomic status, when they cannot get out of this program by paying fines, and when they end up with worse jobs. We see that infringes on their autonomy and harms their ability to support for their families by earning wage. Second, we have the harms to the state. Wasted training of money and other valuable materials for people who are just going to leave the second they no longer have to be there And we see that coercion will decrease morale, which decreases output, which means to worse care for our communities than we already have. Thank you.
Listening to the speech coming out of the opening opposition, I found some quite significant internal contradictions. They assert first and foremost that we aren't going to compensate these people in any way, and that couldn't be further from the truth. My partner modeled in that we would be framing this organization around the military and AmeriCorps, both of which offer benefits to the people operating within those organizations. And this is where the contradiction comes to bear. They say it will be too costly, but we aren't paying them. Clearly, they don't believe in their own arguments. We will be paying these people. They will have plenty of money to save and make do in the intermediary time. Millions of Americans live good lives while operating in the military and benefit from working with the AmeriCorps. Then looking at the second argument, a fee for rich, an infringement on the rights of the poor, they say. Well, first, we offer to you a fairly stringent mechanism, including arrest, which will require people from all socioeconomic backgrounds to engage in this program. But even if that didn't occur properly because of something like bribery, like they seem to assert, let's look at the alternative, where rich people currently already don't have to do manual labor, but instead benefit from an internship from Goldman Sachs that their parents taught them. This is no worse than the status quo in the worst case scenario, but more than likely, it will look like the equitable assignments like we got during the Vietnam draft, whereupon, yes, even rich kids had to go to fight on the front because the government is less influenced because they have standard operating procedures than any other institution. Okay, then on to coercion and social cost. First, I would offer to you that there have been continuous studies by the Department of Labor Statistics which say that even a one-year commitment would be more than enough to pay off the cost of investing in these people because we get significant human investment. That is, we teach these people skills that they need for later life, both hard and soft skills that I'll get into later. But also the national service increases a lifelong commitment mentality. That is, after spending a year in social service, people begin to visualize themselves as part of society and then continue to volunteer decades after they leave. This is not a one-year commitment, but a change in the way people think. And then finally, on coercion. First off, the government coerces people all the time. They coerce you to wear your seatbelt and to pay your taxes. So coercion is not on face problematic. And more than 71% of people would willingly engage in such a program. And so there's no reason to believe that we'll see this widespread protest and underperformance, especially when economic research coming out of Israel in 2004 saw that people who were conscripted participated at just the same quality level as people who chose to enter those services of their own volition. Before my constructive bunch.
Sure, so if so many people would willingly do this, then why do we need to make this program mandatory? If we can get these benefits anyways, why do we need to use force?
Because people just don't make the leap. There's no reason that they choose not to. They just have other things come up. But once we have a government say, this is really a necessary endeavor for us to participate in, that's when people begin to truly see its value. And that's when they will decide that it's worth making the leap, going to a recruiter or filling out their form and investing their time in their community. Okay, moving on to my construct. I think first and foremost, we need to realize the importance of the state. The state, the community, is what saved humanity from the natural position, from being tired, afraid, and alone all the time. Through collective action, we have been able to radically change the human condition. And that requires collective sacrifice. It is important that we incentivize this collective sacrifice, both through government legislation and through a change in our social norms. And requiring a one-year commitment is an amazingly effective way to do that. First, I'm going to address the necessity of social action in fact, extending upon my partner's points regarding the military and community service. But then I'm going to expand on the importance of social mindedness and talking about the ideological change we're going to see in society. So first on the necessity of social action. Realize that we do have a massive problem in our military. My partner talked about the internal perception, but we also have a worldwide perception issue. Our failure in Afghanistan and our drawdown on our military defense obligations around the world has left a perilous power vacuum, which has seen foreign actors such as Russia and China rushing to fill the gap. And it is dangerous for us to allow them to do that. Geopolitics loathes a power battle. It is important now that we take bold action to show our allies that we are committed to defending the world, continuing to promote rights and democracy everywhere it exists, and requiring our citizens to invest in these values by joining the military or other such programs enables us to display this commitment in a very real way, increasing the confidence of our allies and our position in the world. It shows that Americans are invested in their ideology. But then on community well-being, realize that even domestically, we will see massive benefits, both in the short run and in the long run. The short run benefits manifesting in social services, where education, homelessness, and health have been problems which plague our society. We now have a massive body of people to invest in eliminating these social ills, with a payoff of more than $14 for every dollar in lost wages coming from countless government studies. But then also we see development of the people participating in these programs. Hard skills like learning how to care for their own health, or soft skills such as learning discipline and cooperation over this term. Now, let's look at how we can promote social mindedness. Social mindedness is a value we can instill by requiring people to participate in a social action. Our society is fractured. Urban and rural, black and white, rich and poor, we are no longer working together. But by instituting this program, we can promote social cohesion by the creation of a common experience. Humans band together through common endeavors because we have a shared goal and a common conversation point through which we can relate to every other person in our society. We will be able to relate to them on a more personal basis. But also through contact theory, when we begin to interact with people from every background, only then will we be able to truly understand them and engage in common actions more effectively. Moreover, we will see more investment in communities in general over a lifelong process when it is no longer a community, but my community that I have helped build through my year of community service. Then we see individual commitment. When we see people directly investing in their community, we also see more political action because people, once again, see it as their own and as though it is worth defending. It is necessary that we promote an ethic of community. It is necessary that we promote a communitarian ethic in our society, and a movement towards national service is the most effective way to do so. Thank you.
I agree with a lot of what Henry tells you, but I do not agree that we should make this program mandatory, because that is the pivotal piece of the whole debate here that you have to understand. We absolutely support making this an option, supporting this, promoting this, making this visible to people, and making this clear as something that, yeah, this would be awesome if you do, because we think if 71% of Americans are in support of this, then that seems like a great call that we should be looking towards it. But don't mandate it. Once you require it, once you force people to comply, right? The US is not Israel as much as Henry would like you to think. We can't even agree about wearing masks. When you try to coerce people into doing something, the moment you make it mandatory is the moment that they push back and rebel against that, right? This is not something that we can just jump into and impose upon every single person in the community. This is too much of an imposition. Go ahead.
The government has instituted droughts of times of turmoil, and this most certainly is a time of turmoil with political strife and COVID at our doorstep. Why is it suddenly true that people will rebel this time, but not in the past?
I think part of the fact is that this current time of strife that we're in would respond very poorly to this sort of government force. You need to be very gentle and very careful with this sort of thing. This sort of brute force government action will not be reacted well to. But moreover, I think we can look, Henry tries to justify this based on the draft. Last time we tried a draft, like we had riots in the streets all over the nation. This was not something that everyone supported and went along with, right? Moreover, as we can see from the military now, which has vocally advocated against the draft, vocally advocated against this sort of mandatory service, it's really not effective at creating long-term civic engagement, right? The military wants people who will become a part of the military, who work their way up, who are invested in the long term. They have specifically advocated against requiring participation because then they're just training people in and then sending them away as soon as they're trained to no net benefit. You don't reduce the recruitment costs like Athenia wants you to know, because like you're still needing to recruit people to be there in the long term. It's the same with volunteer organizations, like Cora told you, right? That as soon as you make this sort of thing mandatory, right, then you start to create resentment, you start to create pushback, you start to undermine their ability to be volunteer organizations. You cannot compel compassion out of someone. You cannot force them to be civically engaged, right? All of the impacts that they try to bring you, they try to tell you that this will increase the trust between groups, increase the trust in government. Yes, absolutely, when it's an opportunity that someone has stepped into and embraced. When you force this upon someone, do you think that is going to make them more likely to trust the government, more likely to trust the people that they're working with who are also forced there, who also resent the government? Like, even if that's only 29% of the population, right? That is a huge percentage of the population to be alienating here, to be trying to compel against their will. Only 20% of the population actually supports the government, has confidence that they're going to do the right thing. At that point, whatever action that Henry and Athenia try to tell you to do is going to become politicized. It is going to become a tool and a weapon of politics that a large proportion of society is not going to go along with. And at that point, what do they tell you happens then? Well, we will increase people's taxes. We will send them to prison. We'll send them angry texts. Like, you're going to send someone to prison because they were unwilling to go do public service in any circumstances, right? That could be because they have an internship waiting for them, sure. That could also be because their family at home needs them to help support them, because they're a single parent with young children, needs another person in the house to help keep an eye on things. They could have their own children, as Cora told you, which goes completely unresponded to, right? There are all sorts of special circumstances here that there are no exemptions for, and that there's no way around, right? This is simply unreasonable to impose this, especially when it's unnecessary, right? The opportunity cost, Henry tries to tell you that this is ultimately going to pay off for these people in the long run, even if there's these short-term harms, because it teaches them hard skills, it teaches them soft skills, right? The opportunity cost is that every dollar of service they provide to the state, they forego $2.50 of their own earnings, according to the Presidential Commission when it looked into this, right? This is perhaps some benefit to the government when it's getting cheap labor. I guess it's not free, but Henry seems to think it's going to be a whole lot cheaper than the government paying anyone else to do it. At which point there's also passing off this harm to the individual that is simply not acceptable, and it is simply not necessary, right? Volunteer organizations don't push for this because they want volunteers. They want people who are engaged, who choose to partake in civic action. You can't make people engage with civic duty. You can create options, you can create opportunities, and generally people react well to that. But when you just try to use force as a blunt instrument here and to ignore all of this unique and special circumstances that may plague individual lives, you're only going to cause a lot of suffering and hardship for those people who are unable to participate as they might, even if they might wish to. And then you're going to turn another portion of the population against you, right? To make them resent this. Because as soon as you tell someone they have to do something, they want to do it less. If someone chooses to be there, that is one thing. And they can then, whatever they're doing, whatever they're participating in, they've done by their own choice. When you make them be there, then the instinctive human response is always to push back against that and say, no, you can't make me. And then I guess we're throwing a lot of people in prison. And that seems like a really terrible solution to the problem of not having community service that we really don't need at this point. On the whole, we think that making this an option for people, we think that encouraging people to serve in the military, to provide community service, could be hugely beneficial to the US. But to make this a point of force and compulsion is simply to go too far.
So my thanks to the debaters who took the time to lay out the arguments for and against this discussion. What we're going to do now is take a pause in the debate and provide you, the audience, the chance to get involved by asking some questions, posing some arguments, asking the debaters to respond to specific points that you'd like to make. If you look at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom controls, there's a Q&A button that allows you to put a question into the chat or put a question into the Q&A exchange that we will then pass along to the debaters, that you can interact with them and have the opportunity to see what their response to your question or your argument might be. But before we turn it over to you, I've got a couple of questions of my own, because one of my favorite parts about a debate is that I get the chance to ask questions of the debaters too. So let me ask a couple of questions just to kind of get the pump primed for the audience interaction tonight. I'm going to ask first to the con side. So one of the main arguments that the con side made was that there are roughly 70% of people who are in favor of this, and a substantial portion of people who are willing to do this of their own accord. Volunteerism, you say, it's a much better way to address that. But isn't it the roughly 30 to 40 or 50% of people who wouldn't otherwise do it? Aren't those the very people that we need to reach and get involved in civic life and make them feel like they're part of the nation and working collectively on a project?
I think those are the very people who will push back against this most harshly. They might be persuaded over time if this sort of volunteerism becomes a part of the community and a part of the culture. But at the point where the government says, no, you must do this, the same people who don't want to help government in the first place are going to be the same ones who push back and try to make the government force them into it.
It's important to meet people where they're at. To try to force them to get them where you want to go from day one generally makes it harder for that person to ever do that activity.
But if we had a circumstance where there was voluntary involvement in civic life, and then that began to erode and decline, what options, what optimism do you have that that's ever going to return? In other words, we can't persuade people to wear a mask. You yourself talked about this, right? We can't persuade people to wear a mask. How are we going to persuade people who are reluctant to otherwise do so to give service to their country?
I don't know, Steve, but I do know that force is not the answer.
Fair
Force is
enough.
perhaps
Fair
the
enough.
worst possible.
I'll look forward to the summary on that. I wanted to ask the pro side a question as well. This came up a bit in Birch's speech, but I wanted to give you, particularly Henry and Athenia, a chance to respond to this. Given the polarization that our society currently faces, given the resistance that so many people have to the most base accommodations that the government asks of you, why are you optimistic that a program like this would work? You've mentioned a couple of different theories, but Birch related back to the discussion of the draft in the 60s and early 70s, which is the most recent example we have of compulsory national service. That was resisted vociferously and certainly caused a great deal of strife in our society. Why can we expect that this time it's going to work better?
We have wandered away from a strong communal identity in the past few decades. But the values of duty, of patriotism, of sacrifice are still instilled in every person in the United States. When the government actually comes calling, it can call on those fundamental values. We have seen this in military recruiting. Those keywords are wonderfully effective if they actually get communicated to the population, because people believe in these values. So when the government stands up and says, we are going to say, this is your duty, Democrats and Republicans are going to come to the government's call alike, and as reflected by the 71% who would do it voluntarily. But when we look to the draft in the 70s, which was the example we got, that came after a good amount of war where there was any significant opposition. At the beginning, there was a little bit on the university campuses, but it took years of war before people were really irked about the draft. So I think if once again the government comes calling and says there is a social need, unless we're sending people to die in Vietnam for another 20 years, people are going to fall.
And additionally, I'd like to add that if you're looking to persuade somebody or change their mind, a good way to do that often is to put them in a novel circumstance and put them around novel ideas and novel experiences. Nothing will change my mind better than being in a circumstance and finding it's not as tyrannical as I originally expected. And so I think the little bit of coercion at the beginning gives some of these people that are, you know, so dead set against civic duty, the opportunity to get their hands in it and find how rewarding it can actually be. And then that could persuade them. And then they could help to persuade other people that believe that tyranny of the state is the ultimate wrong, to convince them, you know, to convince them that it's not so bad. And persuasion by the converted is very effective.
Marcia, let me ask you if there are any questions that have been posed in the Q&A section. If you could pass those along to us if there are any there.
Yeah, we've got 2 questions right now, and just another plug, folks, you can add your questions to that Q&A. I'll start with the first one we have. If a person has a physical or mental disability that even impairs their basic daily activities, would they still be required to serve community service?
That's a really good question. So one of the complaints that the con had was that there wasn't a lot of details in the model. Here's a chance to specify who would be required to perform service, and would there be different sorts of service that perhaps people with physical or mental disabilities would be able to provide service as well?
I think it would be a discredit to people with even moderately severe physical disabilities, such as being permanently confined to a wheelchair. I think it's a discredit to them to say that they can't serve their community. If someone is fully incapacitated and cannot do anything, then I'm fine with literally just allowing the government to give them a non-existent job and give them a paycheck, because that probably helps satiate the low disability payments that they're getting. The government will put people to use in the best way possible. Most people with disabilities can do something, and even those who can't do anything, what is that? 0.1% of the population? That's around the area.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to add too that a lot of people with disabilities right now are able to work in environments with assistants that help them do those activities, and that gives them a sense of pride in their ability to achieve, and often has really positive outcomes for the individuals. So we could offer the same programs where people with significant disabilities have an aide that works with them to help them perform their job.
Not to mention the contact theory that you were arguing, that more exposure to people with disabilities might make us appreciate them as well-rounded human beings rather than just isolated identities. I want to turn that over to the con side as well and ask you to respond to that. One of the complaints that the con side had was that there was not this broader concern for who is going to be permitted to perform the service and who might otherwise be exempted. Do you think that there would be manipulation of that process? You mentioned that there might be rich people who buy their way out of it. We've all heard of stories of people who made up reasons or were able to secure doctor's notes or medical exemptions from the draft. Do you think we would see an increase in that if we had this requirement?
Yes. Because at the point in which you have jobs that are made for people to do nothing, people will try to get those jobs. And then there's competition for them. And then you can pull strings to get one of those jobs. You can still not perform the service, even if that's not what that position was originally created.
All right. Marcia, you said you had at least one more question for us.
Yeah, we've had a few more come in, so I've got about 5 if you have time. The next question is thoughts from both the pro and con sides on service linked to citizenship.
Service linked to citizenship. So for those people who aspire to become American citizens, could you imagine some sort of program by which they could earn their citizenship through a period of service?
I think that's an amazing opportunity and a great way to include contact theory, as well as provide people a mechanism by which they can become a part of the country. Yes.
Consa, do you think this would more satisfy your no compulsion or no coercion sort of expectation, that instead give rewards, more clear rewards to people who are willing to commit to that service?
Certainly, I think especially with as a offering of incentives and offering of just making it something that is clearly voluntary, I think that could be a very different thing.
Okay. Marcia, what's our next question?
Okay, next is why was this age group in particular chosen rather than an older age group?
Okay, well, first of all, I'll say I wrote the topic. And so
This one's on you, Steve.
The debaters didn't necessarily have a choice as to what age group they had to define. But I think it's worthwhile at least observing that that's a particularly formative period in people's lives where they're mature enough to know what they're interested in doing in life and mature enough to make a significant contribution, but not so enmeshed in their adult life that they probably don't have some flexibility and opportunity to grow from an experience like being placed in a community service or a military service position for a year. That's why roughly we were looking at that age group. Could it be older? Sure, I don't have any problem with that, but this is the one we decided. How about our next question?
Okay. So I'm going to paraphrase this question just for clarity's sake. One of the debaters mentioned or indicated that Black and white, rich and poor are more against each other now. And this attendee notes that he's 54, or they are 51, and see more cohesion and support between those groups now than they had experienced before. Do you have any particular data or sites to support that claim? That we're more against one another than before?
So I think that the question probably pertains to a claim made by the pro side, that's right. Henry.
So what I'm pulling from was an article coming from CNN that showed how political groups typically interact on social media and in their voting practice. So it related these two variables. And what it showed is that people were gradually moving into tighter and tighter online communities, and then those online communities were reflected in their daily action. So, for instance, as these online communities are created, they typically coalesce around a single and often immutable trait, such as skin color, or sometimes background traits, such as economic status. Then they begin to only associate with people from that area. And this is data coming from the last 5 years, just showing that people generally engage in reinforced echo chambers.
We've heard a great deal about that, certainly with social media. On to our next question. I think there's a couple left, maybe.
Yeah, we can do one more. So our last question is, wouldn't making this mandatory contradict the freedom that we've been fighting for?
Now that's an interesting question. The balance of rights and responsibilities is also always critical. Let's do it this way. I'm going to give the con side the first shot at that question, and then we'll turn it back to the pro side, and then we'll move on to our summaries.
I mean, absolutely, yes. Like, I think the circumstances under which our freedom should be abridged only when that is absolutely necessary. It's at a point where there's plenty of reasons that is not necessary here, or that there are alternative means for the government to achieve similar ends, and that a voluntary program could very well be very nearly as effective. I think none of the thresholds that would be needed for making this program compulsory are anywhere close to what they would need.
All right. So is there an inherent contradiction in requiring people to do something in order to preserve the nation that guarantees their freedoms?
There will always be limitations on people's freedom in a cohesive society. We, for instance, restrict your freedom, which is given to you by the state of nature in which you exist, to assault someone when they're saying something you don't like. That enables someone else to have the right to freedom of speech. Yes, we might have to relinquish freedom over 1 year of our lives, but in order to ensure that we can have, in the case of Afghanistan, a secure society, we entered Afghanistan after 2001, and we do it to ensure political freedoms and also economic freedoms, if we're going to include all of the 4 freedoms put forth during the Great Depression. Every social service which we create helps people actualize in different ways. If we can have a small abridgment of one freedom for the preservation of many others, that's a calculus in which we must engage.
Sounds like a perfect place to turn the opportunity back to the debaters to provide the summary of each position. Remember, the summary speeches are somewhat different than the first 4 speeches that began this debate. First of all, each side gets only one summary speech, so they have to make a decision about which of their debaters is going to make their summary for their side. Second, these speeches are shorter. They're only 4 minutes long, which means that despite the fact that we've had 28 minutes worth of arguments and 15 or so minutes worth of discussion, they need to bring all of their case to a point in that short 4 minutes. The final difference between these speeches is that there are no interruptions allowed. So no points of information can be offered by the other side during these 4-minute speeches. The time is exclusively to the debater to summarize the position that they've been advocating. Once again, we're going to start with our pro side to provide the summary first. We'll then turn back to our con side to provide their, sorry, we're going to start with, I gestured in the right direction. I said the wrong word. We're going to start with our con side first, and then we'll close with our pro side, each of whom will get 1 4-minute opportunity to summarize their position. So at this point, I'd like to now open the floor to the con side to provide their summary speech.
All right, so there are 2 principal categories of stakeholder, 2 different ways that we can. First, we can look at the benefits and costs to the individual. Second, we're going to look at the benefits and costs to society as a whole. So to look at the individual, right? Henry just told you, right, about how sometimes we have to restrict rights to preserve freedoms. Usually that's pretty specific. I really don't see what we're saying here. On the whole, Cora told you, right, about how ultimately this program is just going to lead to resentment and apathy as people's personal economic lives are damaged, as their opportunities after graduating high school are infringed, after how they are losing this fundamental autonomy and the wealth that they could earn in that, and how that has impacts upon them, their family, everyone that they would normally be supporting or interacting with as they are torn away and sent off to do some volunteer service that will not be well compensated and that will just give them a year somewhere else to do something. We don't think they're going to get any real significant benefits, right? When you force someone into something like this, it undermines the camaraderie, and they're ultimately not benefiting from the long-term commitment that more traditional volunteers would have or military service would provide, right? So they're not being connected, they're not remaining in that sort of community, they're not forming these connections. We don't think that those benefits to the individual are really going to actualize. Instead, we think that in the minority of cases where people would choose not to do this sort of program, there's going to be a lot of pushback. It's going to get very politicized, and it's going to only spawn further lack of trust in government. It's not going to make things better. They're not going to trust people or get along nicely. Remember that just like Henry told you that like the one place where the Vietnam War was consistently protested at universities is this same 18 to 22-year-old group of people that he's proposing we coerce now. So on the in terms of individual benefits, sure, they may gain some job skills, but they could get that anyways voluntarily. It's not working. Second, on society, what do we see from more of the societal impacts, right? So I think we can continue that trend of politicization and lack of trust and divisiveness that the proposition seems to want to solve. But using force as a blunt instrument in the United States, where freedom is perhaps one of our most traditional and highly valued ideals, is not going to be effective. That's not going to be something that people can just support and go along. Moreover, when you see what that looks like, if you just have just a couple people who resent being there, how that impacts broader volunteer culture, right? As Cora told you, how this hurts morale and how this changes the way that people interact with one another over time. It changes the way that these volunteer organizations work. And ultimately, it hurts the already fairly excellent volunteer community that exists here. We don't think that is going to be worth it. We don't think it's going to increase trust in government, right? If you want to increase trust in government, give people this option. Let people choose to participate. Because when people choose, then they're there by their own decision, by their own will, and they're doing what they want to do, right? As they've already told you, most people will do this anyways. That's the key point here. Once you start forcing people, then you have to start dishing out punishments when people don't comply. You have to start tolerating the people who just don't want to be there, who are constantly, who in the military military, right, have been shown to have higher rates of disciplinary problems, who are not interested in long-term betterment, right? Whoever it is, they have reasons to be elsewhere. We think that we ought to respect those reasons and their individual rights to choose. And that ultimately volunteerism is excellent, but coercion is not. Thank you.
When Obamacare was first launched, it was hated by the Republican Party. It wasn't too popular. But just 2 years after its launch, it became one of the most popular programs in the United States. Because though people lost some freedom, though the individual mandate was passed, people then found out how beneficial that program was. And now, at Republican conventions, politicians who oppose Obamacare get booed off the stage. We sometimes have to restrict people's rights, but in doing so, we change social paradigms and we implement policies that, once they are accepted, no one can imagine why they opposed them. That is what we are proposing today, a program so incredibly beneficial to every individual and the society as a whole, that one day people will laugh that they opposed it in the first place. And at that point, coercion will be a thing of the past. There will be no functional inhibition on people's rights. People will just understand that it is communal action which is required of them to participate in this national service. And that 71% of willing users is going to reach 100%. Now, Birch breaks down his speech across benefits to the individual and then benefits to society. I'm going to briefly cover the individual, then I'm going to cover society. On the individual, what we offer you on the proposition is healthcare, is security, is prosperity. We can offer you real things, food on your table, childcare while you're at work, while they offer you nothing but the abstract value of freedom. And I tell you, that is not something you can put on the table when your children are hungry. Go for real change. Do not allow abstract fears to take you away from the tangible. Individuals will get behind this program after they see its merits. Now on the benefits to society. First, I would like to push back against the idea of choice, because choice is not enough. There has always been the choice to be a better community member, but people are not engaging in that choice. Volunteerism is not enough. We still see homeless people lining the streets. We still see soup kitchens without enough to feed all of the demand. And at that point, we need to make that marginal change. We need to coerce people, yes, but it is warranted, because society is something that we owe an obligation to, because society has helped bring us up. It has helped teach us. It has helped provide the stability which allows us to have jobs and get all of the wonderful goods which make our life better. Society has a right to demand something of us in return, and a minor increase in volunteer action, 1 year of your life, is such a small sum to offer for such the great benefits that society is able to return to us. Realize that the opposition team has no solution. They endorse only the status quo, and the status quo is failing people. What we offer you is action, small incentives. When they are aggregated across the millions of people who will go through this program, transforms the nature of our society. Whereupon we are no longer constrained by the current, government costs. And we are able to mobilize millions of people to create the social goods we need. But at the end of the day, we also change hearts and minds. We are representing a paradigm shift whereupon we can instill the values of duty and patriotism. So that this is not a one-year commitment, so that people remember that their obligation to society is something which spans their entire life, where people can be reminded of the communitarian ethic which I discussed earlier, and they do not spend 1 year, but now when they are working their job later in life, they volunteer for a Little League team, or they hand food out at their church, and in that way, we don't mobilize a couple million people who are 18 years old, but we mobilize the entire population for the social good. Thank you.
So normally at the end of the debate, I would ask the audience to give the debaters a big round of applause. Of course, we're not going to be able to hear you if you choose to applaud for us, but I would like to at least ask you to join me in sending positive thoughts to the debaters and appreciation for their efforts here tonight. I thought they did a wonderful job on all four parts of representing their positions. I would remind you once again to take a look at the chat version or the chat function on Zoom to look for the calendar, the link to the calendar for more Democracy and Civic Action Week events that are coming up later this week. I want to again express our appreciation and gratitude to the Center for Community Engagement and Learning for inviting us to be part of Democracy and Civic Action Week. We always enjoy doing so. And finally, I encourage you to keep in mind that, like all good debates, you should view this as not the end of a conversation, but the beginning of a conversation. Continue to have these discussions with your friends and your family. Come to some understanding of what our nation requires and whether or not this program might be the way to progress. Thank you all very much for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next year for our next Democracy and Civic Action Week.